A simple visit, a shocking turn. It was a warm, golden afternoon when 17-year-old Tara Williams, a bright-eyed teenager with dreams as big as the sky, walked into the sleek, polished jewelry store. The sun filtered through the glass windows, casting delicate shadows across the sparkling gems and precious metals within the store. For Tara, who had grown up in a modest neighborhood, jewelry had always seemed like a symbol of elegance and achievement, a dream for the future. Today, she was simply indulging in a small escape from her routine, taking in the beauty of the glimmering diamonds and fine gold chains. She wore a simple outfit, jeans, a light t-shirt, and her favorite sneakers. Nothing flashy, nothing extravagant, just her curiosity, and a sense of quiet confidence. She wasn't there to buy anything. She knew better than to even think about stepping into such an expensive store with a slim budget. Tara had visited high-end stores before, always finding a way to admire the intricate designs without the pressure of expectation. Today was no different. As she walked through the door, the air seemed to change. It wasn't a noticeable shift at first, just a subtle tension, as if the store had become aware of her presence in a way that felt unfamiliar. She walked with her head held high, scanning the glass cases that displayed everything from diamond-encrusted watches to pearl necklaces. Her fingers itched to touch the cool glass, to feel the smooth, intricate carvings of each piece. But Tara was cautious. She knew her place. She understood the boundaries. And today, she was just a curious observer in a world of unattainable luxury. She stopped in front of a display featuring a delicate bracelet, a piece that glistened under the soft lighting of the store. It wasn't ostentatious but had an understated beauty that caught her eye. Tara leaned forward, her fingertips lightly grazing the surface of the glass, taking in every small detail. She imagined what it would be like to wear such a piece, to feel its weight on her wrist, a reminder of all the things she could one day achieve. But as her gaze lingered on the bracelet, something strange happened. She began to feel a growing awareness of the eyes upon her. It wasn't overt, but it was undeniable. The staff behind the counter, who had been busy with other customers just moments ago, now seemed to watch her every movement. She brushed it off at first, telling herself that it was nothing, just her imagination. Maybe they were simply busy with their tasks. Maybe they were just noticing a new customer entering their space. Yet, the more Tara moved, the more she felt like a spotlight was shining directly on her. A cold draft seemed to fill the room, although the air conditioning was steady. She looked up briefly, catching the eye of a woman standing near one of the counters. The woman immediately turned her gaze away, but not before Tara noticed the quick flash of suspicion in her eyes. Tara's pulse quickened, and a strange discomfort settled in the pit of her stomach. She was used to people staring at her. It wasn't unusual to be noticed as one of the few black faces in certain spaces, but this felt different. This felt like judgment. Still, she refused to let the unease take hold. She continued her quiet perusal of the store, making sure to stay out of the way of other customers. Her confidence was grounded in the knowledge that she belonged there as much as anyone else. She had every right to appreciate beauty, to let herself dream of things beyond her current reality. It was only a store after all. It was a public space. She had every right to be there, just like anyone else. But the tension began to build in the air. The store manager, a sharp-eyed woman in a crisp business suit, had been observing Tara from behind the counter. Her eyes were narrow, focused, and calculating. Tara felt her stare like a weight pressing down on her, as though the woman could see through her. The manager, a woman in her mid-40s, had probably seen many young customers come through the door, all of them eager to make a purchase, and perhaps just as many eager to be noticed. But Tara wasn't like those other customers. Tara didn't fit the profile the manager had in mind. A sense of unease crept up Tara's spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She thought back to the countless stories she had heard over the years. The stories of black people being treated differently simply because of their skin. Tara had never been naive about the way the world worked, but she had always hoped that her experiences would be different. Maybe this time, She could walk through life without being seen as a threat, without being judged before she even spoke. But today, those hopes seemed to be fading. Tara shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the back of the store to see if the manager's watchful eyes were still on her. They were. And now, the woman was standing. The manager's posture was stiff, her eyes locked onto Tara, unblinking. There was a quiet intensity to the moment, one that Tara could feel deep in her bones. The staff members, who had been busy moments before, had stopped working and were now eyeing Tara from a distance, as if waiting for something to happen. Tara, ever the composed young woman, refused to let the tension consume her. She slowly stepped away from the display case, her fingers still tingling from where they had briefly touched the glass. She told herself it was nothing, just the nervous energy of the store, perhaps. But the whispering voices from the staff were unmistakable. She could hear snippets of conversation, too low to make out exactly what they were saying, but the tone was clear. Suspicion. They were talking about her. As Tara continued her walk through the store, heading toward another display of gold rings, the store manager moved with her, her footsteps barely audible but deliberate. Tara's heart began to race. Was she being followed? The bracelet that had once caught her attention now felt like an anchor around her wrist, a symbol of all that was wrong. She had only been admiring the jewelry, yet the way she was being treated made it feel as though she were a criminal simply for existing in the space. And then, as if confirming her deepest fear, the manager's voice rang out, louder than before. "Put that down." The words were sharp, cutting through the stillness of the store like a knife. Tara's fingers stilled on the bracelet she had been admiring, her breath catching in her throat. She looked up slowly, meeting the manager's eyes, now filled with accusation. "I'm just looking," Tara said, her voice steady, though her insides felt like they were unraveling. "I'm not doing anything wrong." But the manager wasn't listening. Her eyes didn't soften, didn't show any understanding. "We know what you're up to," she said, her voice icy. The words struck Tara like a slap in the face. She hadn't even done anything wrong, and yet she was being treated as though she were guilty of a crime she hadn't committed. Tara's mind raced. She was acutely aware of the eyes of the other customers now, watching the exchange unfold. Some of them looked confused, others curious, but no one spoke up. No one questioned the manager's words. The silence hung heavy in the air, thick with the weight of expectation. Tara's heart pounded in her chest as the store seemed to close in around her. She had become a spectacle, and all of it was based on one simple thing: the color of her skin. The accusation. Tara stood frozen, her hand still hovering over the display case, her fingers almost touching the delicate bracelet she had been admiring. The words the manager had spoken felt like they were echoing in her mind, a sharp, reverberating clang that she couldn't escape. "Put that down," the manager had said with such authority, as if Tara had committed some unspoken crime. "We know what you're up to." The accusation hung heavy in the air like a thick fog that she couldn't shake. Tara had been in this store for no more than 5 minutes, and already she was being treated like a thief. The thought was absurd. She hadn't even tried to hide anything or conceal the bracelet in her bag or pocket. All she had done was admire it, a simple gesture that was now being misconstrued as a sign of guilt. Tara felt the familiar rush of blood to her face. The sting of embarrassment was almost too much to bear. She had been looked at as though she were invisible, overlooked for most of her life. But now she was being seen, and it wasn't the way she had ever imagined it. Her presence, her very being, had been reduced to an accusation. Tara's heart began to race as the realization hit her. They thought she was trying to steal. The cold, unnerving silence of the store was broken by the click of the manager's phone. She had already taken out her phone, her fingers moving quickly as she dialed the number. Tara's eyes widened as she heard the muted sound of the manager speaking, her voice low and urgent. The words drifted toward Tara's ears, the meaning clear despite the muffling of the phone call. "Black girl. Suspicion of theft," the manager said, her voice laced with quiet disdain. Tara's heart sank in her chest. The words were an accusation, but they weren't just accusing her of theft. They were painting her as a criminal based on something that had nothing to do with her actions, her character, or her behavior. It was all because of her skin. Tara's mind raced. She couldn't believe this was happening. Her stomach twisted in knots, and a sense of dread washed over her. She had done nothing wrong. She was just a young girl, standing in a store and admiring something she could never afford. But somehow she had been reduced to a suspect. Her chest tightened, and her hands shook slightly. Despite the turbulence inside her, she stood tall, trying to maintain control over her emotions. She wasn't about to let them win. Let them turn her into what they assumed she was. But the longer the manager was on the phone, the more Tara felt like a prisoner in a cage she couldn't escape. The walls of the store seemed to close in around her. The gleaming gold and diamonds in the display cases, once objects of wonder, now felt like they were mocking her, silently accusing her of something she hadn't even thought about doing. Tara looked toward the door, hoping for some sign of relief, but it wasn't coming. The air in the store seemed to grow thicker with every passing second. The other customers, who had previously been oblivious to the tension building between Tara and the manager, had started to notice. They stood at a distance, some eyeing Tara curiously, others watching the manager as she spoke urgently into her phone. But no one moved to help. No one stepped forward to ask what was going on. No one questioned the manager's actions. It wasn't just the manager's eyes that followed Tara now. It was the eyes of everyone in the store. Her discomfort grew with each passing second, as though every single person there was silently judging her. Tara felt like a display herself, like an exhibit in a museum, her every move watched and analyzed. She wasn't even allowed the simple privilege of curiosity. Everything she did, every step she took, every piece of jewelry she admired, was scrutinized. The store manager finished her call, and without missing a beat, she turned her cold gaze back to Tara. Her expression had become one of finality. She had already decided what Tara was, who she was, someone who didn't belong, someone who was only there to steal. "Do you need help with anything else?" the manager asked, her tone now dripping with thinly veiled hostility. It wasn't a question. It was an order, a demand for Tara to leave, to get out. Tara opened her mouth to protest, but before she could say anything, a sound from the door caught her attention. The door to the store opened, and in walked two uniformed police officers. Tara's heart stopped. The sight of their uniforms sent a wave of fear through her, and she froze. The officers didn't even look at her or ask any questions. They simply walked toward her, their boots clicking against the polished floor with authority. They were here because the store had called them. Tara felt like she was sinking, as though the weight of the situation was too much to bear. She had tried to stay calm, to hold herself together, but now it was all slipping through her fingers. She was about to be arrested. She knew it in her bones. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the blood pulsing in her ears as the officers drew closer. There would be no chance to explain herself. One of the officers, a man in his mid-40s, his face hard and expressionless, moved toward Tara. He didn't ask any questions. His eyes were already trained on her like she was a criminal, like she had already been convicted. Tara tried to speak, but her throat closed up. She could feel her stomach churn, the lump in her throat growing larger with every step the officer took toward her. The officer stopped in front of her, his eyes scanning her from head to toe, sizing her up. Tara could see the judgment in his gaze, even without words. He didn't care who she was, where she came from, or what she had been doing. He had already made up his mind. "This the one?" the officer asked, his voice harsh, without an ounce of empathy. His eyes flicked toward the store manager, who nodded quickly, her face a mask of self-righteousness. "Yes," the manager replied, her voice thin and sharp. She was holding a bracelet. We believe she was about to steal it. Tara's breath hitched. The accusation hung in the air like a curse. The officers didn't question her. They didn't ask if she had stolen anything. They didn't ask for her side of the story. They just took the manager's word as truth and moved toward her, as though their role was simply to enforce whatever had already been decided. Tara felt the heat of her humiliation grow as one of the officers reached for his handcuffs. She was being treated like a criminal, like she had done something that she hadn't even considered. She hadn't tried to steal anything. She hadn't taken a single step toward the door with the bracelet. Tara's hands began to shake, her entire body trembling, not from guilt, but from the weight of what was happening. She was scared, terrified in fact, not because she was guilty, because she knew she wasn't, but because she knew the truth didn't matter in this moment. Her skin was all that mattered. The assumptions people made about her before she even spoke. Her heart raced as the officers closed in on her, their footsteps growing louder in her ears. And just as the officer's hand reached out to grab her arm, the door opened once again, this time with a force that made everyone turn to look. The figure who walked in, tall and imposing, was someone Tara recognized instantly. Her father, Chief Marcus Hayes, walked through the door. His presence cut through the tension like a knife, and the officers halted mid-step, their hands hovering awkwardly at their sides. Tara's heart skipped a beat. Her father had arrived. The calm, unwavering authority of Marcus Hayes was now in the store. But even with him standing there, she still couldn't shake the feeling that everything had already been decided for her. Would they see her father as a shield? Or would they continue with their preconceived notions, dismissing the presence of a father who was also a respected officer of the law? Everything hung in the balance now, the entire store waiting for what would happen next. The eyes of the officers, the store manager, and even the other customers fell on Tara and her father. The uncertainty was palpable, and Tara couldn't help but wonder how long it would take before the truth would actually matter. The arrival of a father. Tara felt a wave of mixed emotions wash over her as the door swung open, and her father, Chief Marcus Hayes, stepped into the jewelry store. The scene that had been spinning out of control in a matter of minutes seemed to freeze in time. Every eye in the store shifted towards him, and for the first time since this nightmare had started, Tara felt a flicker of hope. Her father's towering figure was impossible to ignore. His uniform crisp, his presence commanding respect. Marcus Hayes was no stranger to power. He had risen through the ranks of the city's police force to become the head of a respected division, a man known for his unwavering commitment to justice, integrity, and fairness. But today, he wasn't just the chief of police. Today, he was a father, a protector, and a man who would not allow his daughter to be wrongly accused and mistreated. Tara's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this kind of intervention, hadn't expected the one person who could change the course of this entire situation to walk through the door. But as soon as she saw him, standing there, tall and dignified, her anxiety began to ease, if only slightly. The two officers who had been approaching her stopped in their tracks, their steps faltering as they looked at Marcus. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene in a single glance. The store manager, now visibly tense and flustered, the two officers frozen in place, and Tara, standing alone and vulnerable in the middle of the room. The unease in the store was palpable, and the air, thick with tension just moments ago, felt as if it had suddenly been sucked out of the room. For a brief moment, Marcus said nothing. He didn't rush in to challenge the officers or the manager. He simply stood there, his gaze steady, assessing the situation. Tara, still caught in a storm of emotions, looked at him, trying to steady her breath. She hadn't expected her father to be the one to walk in, to be the one to defend her from the false accusations, but now that he was here, it felt like a lifeline. One of the officers, Officer Reed, hesitated, his hand still resting near his service weapon. His face looked like it was caught between doing what was right and following the orders that had been given to him. Marcus's presence, his unspoken authority, made the officer nervous. The manager, too, seemed to shrink under his gaze, the confidence she had once carried now replaced by an uneasy tension. But Marcus wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let his daughter be dragged into this mess, not when the situation had been so clearly manipulated from the start. "What's going on here?" Marcus's voice broke the silence. It was calm, but there was an undeniable weight to it. It wasn't a question that asked for an answer. It was a statement, a demand for clarity. The officers straightened up, their faces giving nothing away. They had been so quick to assume, so eager to follow the store manager's accusations, that they hadn't even thought to ask Tara what had really happened. Officer Reed opened his mouth, but his words seemed to falter, as if he was unsure how to respond now that the chief was here. "We were called here for a suspected theft," Officer Reed finally said, his voice lacking the conviction it had held moments ago. He didn't look Marcus in the eye. Instead, his gaze drifted back to Tara, still standing there with her hands trembling. It was as though the officer was trying to justify his presence, trying to make it seem like he was doing his job. But Marcus wasn't buying it. Tara's stomach churned as she listened to the officer's explanation. A suspected theft. That was what she had been reduced to. Her skin, her very existence, was now seen as a threat, as something to be feared. Tara had spent her whole life learning how to navigate a world that often saw her as less than, as inferior. But this was different. She had done nothing wrong. She was just a girl, standing in a jewelry store, dreaming of a future she could never afford. But somehow, that was enough to make her a suspect. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he turned his focus to the store manager. She had been the one to make the call, to turn Tara's innocent visit into something that felt criminal. The manager, whose face had been flushed with self-assurance earlier, now looked pale, unsure of what to do. "A theft," Marcus repeated, his voice colder this time. "And what exactly did she steal?" The manager's eyes flicked to Tara, who stood motionless, her hands at her sides. The bracelet, the one that had been the source of all this trouble, still lay in its display case, untouched. Tara hadn't made any move to take it. She hadn't tried to conceal anything. She had simply admired it, but now that act was being twisted into something malicious. "She was holding that," the manager said, pointing with an outstretched finger toward the bracelet that still rested in Tara's hand. Her voice trembled slightly, as though she was beginning to doubt the story she had concocted. "She was holding it, and—" Marcus cut her off sharply. "Holding it," he repeated, his voice almost a growl. "Was it in her bag? Her pocket? Did she try to leave the store with it?" The manager faltered. She hadn't expected Marcus's line of questioning to be so direct, so demanding of answers. She had expected him to take the officer's word for it, to let the situation unfold without scrutiny. But now, under the weight of Marcus's gaze, the truth she had tried to bury began to surface. She had no evidence that Tara had stolen anything. She hadn't even seen Tara try to leave the store. The only thing she had to go on was her assumption, her belief that a young black girl in a store like this was more likely to steal than any other customer. The manager opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was caught. The lie she had so easily told had unraveled in front of her eyes. Tara stood still, her heart beating painfully in her chest. She could feel the presence of her father, strong and unwavering beside her. His authority, his sense of justice, was like a shield protecting her. But even with him there, the sting of the false accusation still burned. Tara had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. She had never been in a situation like this before. She had never imagined that her simple visit to a store could turn into such an ordeal. And yet here she was, caught in a nightmare of someone else's making. "Do you have anything else to say?" Marcus asked, his voice now quieter, but no less forceful. His eyes were trained on the manager, who now stood frozen, her gaze shifting between Tara and the officers. The silence in the store was deafening. Tara's hands were trembling, but she refused to let them see how afraid she was. She knew her father was standing there, his presence a calming force, but the truth was, the damage had already been done. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, Officer Reed shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. He could feel the weight of the situation now. This wasn't just about a stolen bracelet. It was about something much deeper. Tara's father wasn't going to let it slide. He wasn't going to let them assume anything based on their racial biases. The more Marcus questioned the manager, the more her defenses crumbled. The store manager opened her mouth to speak again, but this time, she seemed to be grasping at straws. I didn't know she was your daughter," the manager stammered, her voice cracking under the pressure. "I didn't mean." Marcus's gaze hardened. "Does it matter?" he asked, his voice cutting through the air. "Would you have treated her differently if you knew? Or is this how you treat all young black girls who walk into your store?" The manager's mouth opened and closed, her face flushed with embarrassment. She had no answer, no justification. The reality of her actions was becoming too much to ignore. The silence grew heavier. Tara could feel it, the tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Would anyone stand up for her now? Would anyone acknowledge the damage that had been done? She wasn't just a girl standing in a store anymore. She was a symbol of the injustice that so many had faced, of the assumptions and the racial profiling that continued to pervade society. And as Marcus's eyes locked onto the manager, Tara felt a small spark of something. Something that felt like hope. Perhaps this wouldn't end like all the other stories. Perhaps this time, someone would take a stand. The battle for justice. The silence that followed Marcus's question seemed to stretch on forever, thick with anticipation and discomfort. The store manager, her face now a mix of embarrassment and hesitation, had no answer to Marcus's pointed question. She had expected to call the shots, to control the narrative, and cast Tara as the villain. But now, faced with the reality of her assumptions being called into question by the highest authority in the room, she faltered. Tara could feel her father's presence beside her, his silent strength emanating like a wall of protection. But even with him there, the weight of the situation was still pressing down on her. Her hands trembled, and her chest felt tight, but she refused to show any more fear. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something far bigger, about holding the world accountable for the assumptions it so easily placed on people like her. The store manager, despite the growing pressure, seemed to regain a sliver of her former confidence. She swallowed hard, trying to gather her thoughts, but her voice wavered when she spoke. I didn't know she was your daughter," she repeated, her words coming out in a stammer. "I just saw her holding the bracelet. And Marcus's voice cut through her faltering explanation, his tone growing colder, more demanding. "What does that even mean? She's holding the bracelet. And then what? You assumed she's trying to steal it." The manager's eyes darted to the officers, and then to the other customers who were watching the scene unfold. Tara could sense that there was an uncomfortable shift in the air. What had started as a quiet assumption about Tara's intentions was now turning into a public spectacle. People were starting to take notice of the injustice, and not just in silence. They were witnessing it. Some were watching with curiosity, others with uncertainty, but there was a shift happening. There was an unspoken recognition in the air. Tara was being wronged. And no matter how much the store manager tried to defend her actions, the truth was becoming harder to ignore. Marcus stood tall, unwavering, his eyes locked onto the manager's. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let Tara be swept aside by a moment of bias or prejudice. "This isn't about whether she was holding the bracelet," Marcus said, his voice calm but fierce. "This is about the fact that you saw a young black girl, and before you even spoke to her, before you even gave her the benefit of the doubt, you made an assumption. And that assumption, it was rooted in racism." The words hung in the air, raw and unflinching. Tara couldn't believe her ears. It wasn't the first time she had heard someone point out the ugliness of racial bias, but hearing her father call it out in such a direct way made something inside of her shift. She had always known about the prejudice that ran deep in society, the way people like her were often seen as less than, as threats before they even opened their mouths. But hearing her father speak so boldly made her realize just how deep the problem ran, and how important it was to confront it, no matter how uncomfortable it made people feel. The manager's face went pale, and for the first time, her eyes avoided Marcus's gaze. She was caught in a lie, caught in her own assumption, and now there was no way out. She had hoped this would be a quick fix, an easy way to dispose of a problem she had created in her own mind. But now it was a full-fledged confrontation. Marcus was pushing for answers, pushing for accountability, and Tara couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride welling up inside her. Her father wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let them take her dignity from her without a fight. "Sir, we were just following protocol," Officer Reed said, his voice shaky, as though he, too, was starting to recognize the flaws in the situation. His hand had moved away from his service weapon, and he stood awkwardly, unsure of how to navigate the tension now that the chief was involved. He looked to his partner for reassurance, but the other officer, who had remained silent up until now, seemed just as unsure. "Protocol." Marcus's voice dropped lower, colder. "What protocol are we talking about?" "The protocol that assumes a young black girl is a criminal just because she's in a jewelry store. Is that your protocol?" The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. There was nothing to say. It was too easy to see what was happening now. The assumptions that had been made about Tara had been based on nothing but bias, nothing but the color of her skin. There was no evidence, no reason to suspect her. Yet, they had acted as if she had already committed a crime, as if her presence in the store was an offense in itself. "We are trained to respond to suspicious behavior," Officer Reed stammered, his face flushed. But Marcus wasn't letting him off that easily. "Suspicious behavior," Marcus repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "Holding a bracelet is suspicious behavior. Walking into a store and admiring jewelry is suspicious behavior. Where does that line get drawn? Who decides what's suspicious, and what does that decision say about how we view people? How many times have people like my daughter been falsely accused, simply because of how they look, simply because of their race?" The words were heavy, and they hit like a ton of bricks. Tara felt the sting of her father's words, but there was something cathartic in them too. She had always known the world saw her differently, but hearing her father lay it out so clearly made her understand how deep this issue went, how systemic it was. It wasn't just about this store or this manager. It was about a larger issue, one that affected her and so many others. Tara felt a surge of gratitude for her father. He wasn't just standing up for her. He was standing up for something bigger. He was fighting against the world's assumptions, fighting for justice in a place where it so often seemed elusive. The store manager, her face now flushed with guilt and embarrassment, opened her mouth to speak again, but nothing came out. She was out of excuses. She had no justification. Just then, a voice from the back of the store broke the tension. "I saw everything," a woman said, her voice soft but clear. She was middle-aged, her features kind but weathered, and she had been standing at the far end of the store, quietly observing the entire interaction. Her eyes met Marcus's, and there was something in her gaze that was resolute. That young lady didn't do anything wrong. She was just looking at the jewelry, just like the rest of us. She didn't try to steal anything. She didn't make any suspicious moves. She was just admiring the pieces, like any customer would. Her words, simple but powerful, cut through the remaining tension like a breath of fresh air. Tara's heart swelled with gratitude. Finally, someone was speaking up. Finally, someone was willing to challenge the injustice, to call it out in front of everyone. Tara looked at the woman, her eyes filled with silent thanks. Marcus turned to the woman, his expression softening slightly. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice warm but firm. His focus quickly returned to the manager, who was still standing there, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Are we going to resolve this, or are we going to continue this charade?" Marcus's question hung in the air, charged with finality. The manager had no answer, her silence speaking volumes. For a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. The officers, the manager, the customers, everyone stood in a collective moment of realization. This wasn't just about one girl. This was about the deep-seated prejudice that so often shaped people's actions and assumptions. It was about the need for accountability, the need to confront bias head-on and demand change. Tara stood silently by her father's side, the weight of the situation still pressing down on her. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't over yet, not by a long shot, but with her father by her side, and with people willing to speak out against the wrongs. Tara knew she wasn't alone in this fight. A moment of truth. The tension in the store was palpable, the air thick with discomfort and a sense of impending resolution. Tara stood there, her eyes locked on her father, who had become the embodiment of calm authority in the storm of injustice that had threatened to overwhelm them. Every word he spoke cut through the atmosphere like a blade. Each question, each statement, a demand for truth and accountability. As the store manager stammered, struggling for a way to salvage her dignity, Tara couldn't help but feel the weight of the entire situation bearing down on her. The quiet judgment, the swift accusation, it wasn't just about this store. It was about a lifetime of moments just like this one, moments when assumptions were made based on nothing more than the color of her skin. She had experienced it before in small ways, in the looks she received, the whispers she overheard, the doors that seemed to close just a little quicker when she walked into a room. But today, it was no longer just a feeling. Today, it was out in the open for everyone to see. The invisible chains that had been placed around her for years were suddenly exposed, and now it was clear for all to see just how deep the problem ran. The woman who had spoken up earlier, the one who had stood in the background observing the entire scene, approached Marcus again. Her expression was resolute, a mixture of frustration and determination on her face. Tara could see the quiet courage in the woman's eyes, the kind of courage that came from knowing that standing up for what's right was never easy but always necessary. "I'm sorry to interrupt, sir," the woman said, her voice gentle but unwavering. "But I've been standing here this whole time, and I've seen what happened. The girl," she nodded toward Tara, "didn't do anything wrong. She was just looking, just like the rest of us. She wasn't hiding anything. She wasn't trying to sneak anything into her bag. She was just a customer, admiring the jewelry." The words fell heavy in the room, and for a moment, everything seemed to come to a standstill. The store manager's face flushed even deeper, her hands trembling. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anyone to step forward and challenge her actions. But now, the tide had shifted. Tara wasn't just a girl standing alone in the store anymore. She was a symbol of the injustice that had played out for so long, and this woman, this brave soul, had decided to be her ally. Tara felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over her. She hadn't expected anyone to speak out for her. She hadn't expected this kind of support. But now, with the words of this woman echoing in the store, she realized that sometimes change came in the smallest of gestures. Sometimes, all it took was one person to stand up, to say the truth out loud. She looked at the woman, her heart swelling with gratitude. It wasn't just about this moment. It was about something much bigger. It was about the power of standing together in the face of injustice. Marcus turned to the woman, his expression softening slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but filled with appreciation. "You didn't have to say anything, but you did. And that means something." The woman nodded, her eyes meeting Tara's for a brief moment. In that silent exchange, Tara saw understanding, a shared connection that transcended words. It was the kind of moment that felt like a spark of hope, the kind that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change. But Marcus wasn't done yet. He turned his attention back to the manager, whose unease was now evident in every twitch of her body. The power had shifted in the room, and the manager knew it. Her facade of confidence had crumbled, leaving her exposed in front of everyone. She had been caught in a lie, and now, there was no easy way out. "Let's talk about how this situation was handled," Marcus said, his voice firm, his eyes not leaving the manager's. "You assumed Tara was a thief. You didn't give her the benefit of the doubt. You didn't ask her anything. You didn't consider that she might just be a regular customer. Instead, you saw her skin, and you made a judgment based on that. And when you did that, you didn't just treat her unfairly. You violated her dignity. You turned her into a criminal without any evidence. Do you understand that?" The manager opened her mouth, but nothing came out. There were no excuses, no justifications left. Marcus wasn't asking for an apology, because no apology would be enough to undo the harm that had been done. Instead, he was demanding accountability. He was forcing her to confront the reality of her actions. "Do you think this would have happened if Tara had been white?" Marcus's question hung in the air like a sharp, undeniable truth. "Would you have assumed she was a thief just because she picked up a bracelet? Would you have called the police on her so quickly if she had looked different?" The room was silent. Even the officers, who had been so quick to act before, stood frozen in place. Tara's eyes scanned the faces of the other customers, and she could see it in their eyes. The discomfort, the realization of what had just occurred. Some were looking at the manager with pity, others with disdain. They were no longer passive observers. They were part of this story now, too. The injustice was no longer hidden in the shadows. It was being brought into the light. The manager's face had gone ashen, her hands shaking slightly as she struggled to find something to say. I didn't mean," she began, but her words trailed off, weak and ineffective. "You didn't mean what?" Marcus asked sharply. "You didn't mean to judge her based on the color of her skin. You didn't mean to assume she was a thief because she's black. You didn't mean to turn her into a suspect before you even gave her a chance." The manager's lips parted, but the words never came. She had no defense. She had no excuse. Tara could feel the anger bubbling up inside her, but she kept it contained. She knew this wasn't about revenge. This was about something deeper. It was about forcing people to recognize the harm their biases caused. It was about making sure that what had happened to her didn't happen to anyone else. "Here's the reality," Marcus continued, his voice low but intense. "You don't get to decide who's guilty and who's innocent based on the color of their skin. You don't get to treat people differently because you've made assumptions about them before they've even spoken. That's not how it works, and if you think it is, then maybe you're in the wrong business." The words landed with the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Tara had never heard her father speak so fiercely, but in that moment, she understood why he was the man he was. He wasn't just a police officer. He was a protector, an advocate for justice, someone who would never stand by when something wasn't right. And today, he was standing for her. The store manager finally looked away, her eyes dropping to the floor in what seemed like a mixture of shame and disbelief. She had been caught, and now, there was no escaping the truth. The officers shifted uneasily. They had witnessed everything. The false accusation, the unraveling of the store manager's story, the confrontation. Officer Reed looked at his partner, and for a moment, Tara saw the uncertainty in his eyes. He had been complicit, yes, but he had also witnessed something today that couldn't be ignored. He had seen the truth of what had happened, and now, there was no going back. Would he learn from this? Would he take a stand for what was right the next time? Marcus didn't give them the chance to answer. "I expect a full report on my desk by the end of the day," he said, his voice unwavering. His words were final, and there was no room for negotiation. Tara's heart swelled with gratitude as she realized that her father wasn't just protecting her. He was making sure that this situation wouldn't just be swept under the rug. He was making sure there would be consequences, and that perhaps this moment could become a catalyst for change. Tara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation finally begin to lift. It wasn't over yet, but it was a start. And sometimes, that's all it took. One step forward, one voice raised, one person willing to speak out. As she looked around the store, she saw the other customers, their faces filled with a mixture of shame and realization. Some of them were beginning to leave, but others stood there, watching. Maybe they didn't have the courage to speak up before, but now they knew what had to be done. Maybe next time, when they saw injustice, they would be the ones to step forward, just like the woman who had spoken up for Tara. The truth had been spoken, and in that moment, Tara knew that it would never be forgotten.